When my daughter-in-law, Brenda, threw my gift in the trash, she wasn't just tossing out wood. She threw away 50 years of memories and the love of my late husband. She called it cheap junk. She doesn't know that I don't trade in money or lies. I trade in the truth. And I am about to use that truth to burn her entire fake world to ash. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 68 years old, a recently retired librarian, and a widow. These are the facts. The context is that I have just moved into the home of my only son, Mark, and his wife, Brenda. Their house, located in the manicured, wealthy adjacent suburb of Pinecrest, Ohio, is not a home. It is a statement. It is a cold, minimalist expanse of glass, polished concrete, and shades of grey that Brenda, a self-proclaimed lifestyle influencer, calls curated. It has no soul, no warmth, nothing to suggest that real, messy life happens within its walls. It is a showroom for a life I do not recognize. Mark met me at the door with a smile so bright it was painful, a flimsy shield against the awkwardness that hung in the air between us. "Mum, you're here? This is great, just great." He works for a tech company called Innovatex Solutions, and the stress of it radiated from him, a constant, high-frequency hum of anxiety that seemed tied to the ping of his phone and the avoided topic of money. Brenda glided into the foyer. She did not walk. Her smile was a waxy, perfect crescent that never touched her eyes. "Eleanor, welcome," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "We're so thrilled to have you." Thrilled. I looked at her, standing perfectly posed in her beige linen outfit, and knew that everything in her house, including her husband, existed only to serve her online brand. My room was not a guest room. It was the small, former den, a space clearly meant for a desk and perhaps a treadmill. Not a life. Its single window looked directly onto the loud, throbbing metal box of the central air conditioning unit. Its rattling became the soundtrack to my days. I tried to make myself useful, to earn my keep in this sterile environment. I am a librarian, after all. Organization is in my blood. I unpacked the kitchen boxes. I attempted to organize the cavernous, mostly empty linen closet. But Brenda was always there, a silent shadow, following me, observing. "Oh, Mother Eleanor," she would murmur, picking up a hand towel I had just folded. "We don't place them like that here. It disrupts the visual flow." I was an inconvenient piece of furniture, a relic from a past life that clashed with her modern, empty aesthetic. I quickly learned to make myself small, to take up as little space as possible. I became a ghost in their gallery, careful not to leave a fingerprint, careful not to be seen. I was an interruption, a smudge on her perfect, curated world. I spent most of my time in that small room, surrounded by the few cardboard boxes I had refused to put in storage. One evening, when the house was silent except for the mechanical hum of the air conditioner, I sat on the floor and opened the one I cherished most. It was a simple wooden box, polished smooth by decades of touch. Inside, nestled on dark velvet, was a collection of hand-carved meadowlarks. My late husband, Arthur, had made them for me. He was not a man of grand gestures, but he was a man of quiet, patient love. He had spent hundreds of hours on them in his little workshop, capturing the tilt of a head, the delicate ruffle of a feather. They were his final gift, completed in the last year of his life. I traced the wing of the smallest one, feeling the familiar comfort of the wood. This was my history. This was my soul. And in this cold, sterile house, It felt like the only real thing I had left. It was a Saturday evening. The house hummed with a strained, brittle energy. Mark and Brenda were preparing for a dinner party. One Brenda had described as critically important for her brand. The scent of expensive, minimalist floral arrangements filled the air, a scent so clean it was antiseptic. Mark, his face pale and tight, was adjusting the low-voltage track lighting, while Brenda, in a silk robe, directed him with sharp, clipped commands. I watched them from the hallway. I felt like a miscalculation, a piece of old data that had corrupted their new program. I wanted to bridge the gap. I wanted, foolishly, to connect. I convinced myself that if I offered a true piece of myself, a piece of my history, she might finally see me as a person rather than an obligation. I went to my room. I pulled the polished wooden box from my belongings. I ran my hand over the smooth lid, the wood warm from my touch. Holding it, I walked back to the dining room. Brenda was frowning at a set of napkins, as if they had personally offended her. "Brenda," I said. My voice was quiet, and she sighed, turning around, her irritation obvious. "What is it?" "Eleanor, I am on a schedule." I held out the box. "I wanted to give this to you, as a gesture, a thank you, for having me." She took it, her long, manicured fingers treating it as if it were a strange insect. She lifted the lid. "My husband, Arthur. He carved these," I said, the words rushing out. I needed her to understand its value, a value that had nothing to do with money. "He made them for me. It took him the last 6 months of his life to finish them. They mean a great deal." Brenda stared at the small, perfect meadowlarks nestled in the velvet, her brow furrowed, not with emotion, but with a flat, cold confusion. "Oh," she said. The word was a stone dropping into a well. "How rustic." Her voice was laced with a condescension so potent it stung. She closed the box. "I'm sure I'll find a spot for it. Somewhere." She placed it on a sideboard, where it sat. A dark, warm-blooded thing in a room of cold, grey ghosts. An hour later, the house was in a temporary lull before the guests arrived. I was asked to take the recycling out to the bins by the garage. The kitchen bin was full, mostly of empty designer water bottles and packaging. I carried the bin outside into the dusk. I lifted the lid of the large blue recycling container, and I froze. There it was. My box. It had been tossed in, wedged between 2 empty bottles of expensive wine. I did not feel shock. I did not feel anger. I felt a sudden, terrifying void, a complete cessation of feeling. My hands, moving on their own, reached in and lifted it out. The side was damp from wine residue. I opened the lid. The birds were jumbled. One of the smallest ones, the one Arthur had finished last, had been knocked loose. Its delicate wing, thinner than a matchstick, was broken. I turned. Brenda was standing on the patio, just outside the sliding glass door. She was illuminated by the house's cold, white light, a vape pen in one hand, her phone to her ear. She was talking loudly, her party voice already activated. "No, the entire aesthetic has to be seamless," she was saying. "If it's not authentic, they'll know." I walked toward her, the broken box in my hands. She saw me approaching and her face tightened. "Eleanor, what are you doing? The guests will be here in 20 minutes." I held the box out. "Why?" I said. my voice a dry, rasping thing I did not recognize. Why was this in the trash? Brenda let out an exasperated sigh. She rolled her eyes, a complete, theatrical rotation of contempt. She clicked her phone off. Oh, please. Eleanor, do not be dramatic. She took a long drag from her pen, exhaling a cloud of sickly sweet smoke. It's cheap junk. It's clutter. It completely ruins my aesthetic. Clutter, I repeated. Yes. Clutter. Now, are you done? The glass door slid open. Mark appeared, knotting his tie, his face strained. Brenda, is the... Oh. He stopped. He saw the scene. He saw me, standing in the dark, holding the box. He saw the broken bird. He saw the cold, impatient fury on his wife's face. I looked at my son. I said nothing. My entire being was a silent plea. See me? Say something. Be the man I raised. Mark looked at the box in my hands. He saw the broken wing. He looked at Brenda. He looked back at me. And then he looked at the ground. Brenda, come on, he muttered, his voice so low it was barely audible. He did not look at her. He did not look at me. Then he turned away. I have to get ready for the party. He stepped back inside the house, sliding the glass door shut. The click of the lock was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Brenda's cruelty had been a blow, but Mark's cowardice, his casual, definitive betrayal, that was the thing that broke me. I did not go to the party. I returned to my small room, the one with the rattling air conditioner, and I closed the door. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time in the dark, the broken wooden bird in the palm of my hand. The humiliation, that sharp, physical sting of betrayal, did not dissolve into tears. I did not weep. It was as if a circuit breaker had been flipped. The shock, instead of shattering me, solidified into something else. It turned into a cold, quiet, and absolute stillness. The grieving mother, the accommodating guest. She evaporated. In her place sat the librarian. For 41 years, my job was not just to shelve books. My job was to manage systems. It was to organize information, to cross-reference facts, to find patterns, and most importantly, to identify anomalies, the places where the story did not match the data. I had been retired for 6 months, but my mind had not. I stopped trying to help. I stopped making conversation. I stopped apologizing for the space I occupied. I became a ghost in their house, a silent observer. I faded into the grey, minimalist background, and in my invisibility, I finally began to see. My life became a quiet cataloguing of the data points that did not add up. The first anomaly was the deliveries. While Mark was at Innovatech, the front door became a revolving door for couriers. Boxes arrived daily, sometimes 2 or 3 at a time, from high-end department stores and designer boutiques I recognized only by their expensive, discreet packaging. Brenda would retrieve these boxes from the porch with a furtive energy, her eyes scanning the street, before hustling them into her home office. She always locked the door. I never saw her wear these new shoes or carry these new handbags. They were never mentioned to Mark, who was becoming increasingly frayed. The second anomaly was the phone calls. Brenda spent hours in that locked office. Her voice, usually so curated and smooth for her online audience, would become a low, angry hiss. I could not make out the words, only the cadence, a rhythm of sharp demands, frustration, and a venom that was deeply personal. These were not the calls of a lifestyle influencer coordinating brand deals. The third was Mark. My son was visibly shrinking. He was tethered to his phone, not for social media, but for his banking application. I watched him at the dinner table, his thumb endlessly swiping, checking his balance, his face pale and pinched. The arguments began after midnight, low and vicious, bleeding through their bedroom walls. I heard his stressed-out words, spending, insane, account, bottomed out. Brenda's response was always the same, a blast of cold, dismissive air. You just have to trust my investments, she would snap. Or her trump card, the one that always ended the fight. My family will cover it. Mark, stop panicking. You don't trust me. And he would go silent. Her family. This became the central subject of my research. I spent my days in the den, on my old laptop, and I began to study the fiction Brenda had constructed. Her Instagram, Brenda DeCourcy Life, was a masterpiece of implication. It was a visual thesis on old money aesthetics, all beige, cream, and muted gold. She wrote long, winding captions about her upbringing in Newport, Rhode Island, about the values instilled in her by her grandfather, a supposed shipping tycoon. I cross-referenced. I am, after all, a librarian. I started with the photographs displayed in the living room. They were housed in heavy, ornate silver frames that were completely at odds with the home's stark modernism. I had glanced at them before. Now, I studied them. There was grandfather, a distinguished man with silver hair, smiling on a yacht. There was a lovely group photo on the steps of an ivy-covered building. But the more I looked, the more wrong they felt. The lighting was too perfect. The people were beautiful, but they were looking at the camera, not at each other. There was no shared history in their eyes, no candid intimacy. They looked. I realized with a sudden, cold clarity, like models in a high-end catalogue. The photographs themselves felt too new, the paper too bright. These were not memories. They were props. My room, once a confinement, became my base of operations. The rattling of the air conditioning unit was the only sound as I sat in the dim light, my old laptop humming on my knees. I had become invisible in that house, and so my investigation could begin in plain sight. I started with the name she clung to, her armor and her pedigree. Brenda DeCourcy. She claimed Newport, Rhode Island. She claimed generations of wealth. I am a librarian. My trade is in facts, not fiction. I still retained my professional access, a courtesy extended to retirees, to several powerful academic and genealogical databases. These were not the shallow pools of a public web search. They were the deep archives of census data, property records, and digitized historical registries. I typed the name, DeCourcy. I paired it with Newport. I searched birth records, shipping manifests, and social directories spanning the last 150 years. The results were immediate, and they were definitive. There was no DeCourcy shipping dynasty. There were no DeCourcy socialites attending balls. The name DeCourcy did appear, but not in the grand mansions Brenda posted about. I found a family of DeCourcys who arrived in the 1880s. They were listed in the census records of 1890 and 1900 not as owners, but as employees. They were the gardeners and groundskeepers for one of the actual wealthy families. This was not a simple act of social climbing, not just inflating a story. A person might exaggerate a grandfather's minor partnership into a company, or stretch a modest inheritance into old money. This was different. This was a complete fabrication. She had not embellished a history. She had stolen one, and poorly at that. The curiosity I felt, once a dull ache of confusion, now sharpened into a cold, academic focus. If her past was a lie, her present must be built on the same foundation. I pivoted. I set aside the genealogical records and opened a new tab. I began to research my son's company, Innovatech Solutions. It was a real entity, just as he said, specializing in data management. But their public footprint was modest. They were a mid-level player, respectable, but not extravagant. Yet, Mark and Brenda lived in a house that screamed C-suite, with a mortgage that must be staggering, all while Mark visibly flinched at every argument about spending. I accessed the local business journals and corporate filing databases. The data was dry, but the pattern was there. Innovatech had been struggling, its cash flow thin, until about 5 months ago. Then, I found it. A press release, quietly issued, announcing a major multi-million-dollar capital investment. The source was listed as a private equity group, with a name so generic it was meaningless. Apex Global Holdings. The investment seemed disproportionately large for a company of Innovatech's size, and the timing, just before Brenda's spending accelerated, felt like more than a coincidence. I sat back, the two threads dangling in my mind, a fabricated past, and a suspiciously timed, anonymous flood of money in the present. I returned to her Instagram feed. Brenda DeCourcy, life. I looked at the images again, no longer as a wounded mother-in-law, but as a fact-checker. And there, in the center of the living room, was the silver-framed photograph of her beloved grandfather, the distinguished man on the yacht. I saved the image. I opened a new browser window and navigated to a tool I had often used to teach students how to verify sources, a reverse image search. I uploaded the screenshot. The results populated in less than 1 second. My heart did not pound. It did not race. It simply went cold. The image was not from a private family album in Newport. It was available for purchase on 6 different stock photography websites. I clicked the first link. A large German database. There he was. The file was titled, Elegant Older Man Smiling. The description below read, Portrait of a handsome, distinguished senior man in a suit, enjoying a moment on a boat. Perfect for business, finance, retirement, or lifestyle concepts. Brenda's entire identity, the old money she held over my son, the aesthetic that made my husband's gift cheap junk, had been purchased for a one-time licensing fee. It was a lie. Root and branch. And I, the silent observer, was the only one who had the receipts. The party was Brenda's masterpiece, the apex of her social construction. The minimalist house was packed with the very people Brenda aspired to be, the important local set of Pinecrest. Their voices bounced off the hard surfaces, a chorus of superficial laughter and networking. Brenda, a vision in cream-coloured silk, floated through the crowd, her smile bright and fixed. She was electric, holding court by the minimalist fireplace, her voice carrying as she spoke to a small, rapt audience. The new investment portfolio is simply soaring, she said, with a delicate, self-deprecating laugh. Mark is a genius, of course, but he lets me play with my little projects. I was in my usual role, invisible. I stayed near the kitchen, a ghost in a cardigan, observing. I felt the vibration of a phone in Mark's pocket, then saw him check it. His face, which was already a mask of strained hospitality, went ashen. A moment later, a man in a florist's uniform appeared at the side door, holding an invoice. Mark spoke to him in a low, urgent tone. I watched my son's face as he swiped his card. Once. Twice. The card reader flashed red. Declined. Mark's composure shattered. He hissed at the florist to wait, then grabbed Brenda by the elbow, his fingers digging into the silk, and dragged her into the kitchen, slamming the swinging door behind them. I moved, a shadow detaching from the wall, and stood just outside that door. Their voices were no longer polite. What do you mean? Declined. Brenda's voice was a venomous whisper. The card was declined. Brenda, the florist. The business account is nearly empty. The personal accounts are gone. Where is the money? Mark's voice was cracking, high-pitched with pure, unadulterated panic. It's an investment, I told you. It's a long-term play. What investment? You won't tell me you've been moving money for weeks. The corporate account is a disaster. What did you do? You have to trust me, she shrieked. My family will sort it out if it comes to that. You just don't trust me. Trust you. He was almost sobbing. I don't even know. I pushed the door open. I did not move with anger. I moved with the slow, deliberate calm of a glacier. I had nothing left to lose. They both froze, their faces ugly in the harsh fluorescent light of the kitchen. He can't trust you, I said. My voice was not loud. It was clear, and it cut through the panic in the room like a scalpel. Brenda's face contorted. Get out, you old... He can't trust you, I repeated. Because your grandfather is a stock photo model from Germany. His name is Hans. The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda did not flush with anger. She did not prepare a defense. The colour drained from her face, leaving a sallow, yellowish tint. Her pupils dilated. This was not the reaction of a woman insulted. It was the reaction of a spy whose cover had just been blown. It was pure, unmasked panic. And then she exploded. But the shrapnel was not aimed at me. She turned on Mark. She's lost her mind, she screamed, a full-throated, frantic sound. She's senile. She's jealous of me, jealous of us. She's trying to ruin everything. Look at her. She's trying to destroy our lives. She was backpedaling, physically moving away from me and advancing on my son, her finger jabbing at my face. She's been trying to poison you against me since she got here. She's a miserable old woman. Brenda, Mark whispered, staring at me, his eyes wide with a new, dawning horror. Do not Brenda me, she shrieked, her voice cracking. She turned to me, her eyes two black pits of hate. You miserable old hag, you are trying to steal my husband from me. Then she spun back to Mark. This was the moment, the performance of her life. She gave him an ultimatum. Choose. Right now. Mark. You choose. Me, your wife, our life, or that senile old woman who is trying to destroy us. Get her out of here. Get her out of my house. Right now. My son looked at me. His face was a wreck of fear and confusion. He looked at his wife, the woman who was his ticket to a life he'd never earned. He saw his wealthy wife, his beautiful house, his entire fabricated success, all of it about to vanish. And he made his choice. Mom, he choked out, grabbing my arm. His grip was hard, bruising. Mum, you can't do this. You can't. He didn't mean, you can't be treated this way. He meant, you can't do this to me. He pulled me. He pulled me out of the kitchen, through the side door, past the bewildered florist. He didn't speak as he half dragged me to my room. He threw two of my suitcases on the bed, his hands shaking. Just put things in. Now. 10 minutes later, I was in his car. He didn't speak. He drove past the manicured lawns of Pinecrest, past the perfect, soulless gates, and onto the highway. He drove for 20 minutes until he reached the commercial strip, a place of fast food signs and peeling billboards. He pulled into the parking lot of a weekly rate motel called the Summit View Inn. There were no summits and no views. He got my bags from the trunk and dropped them on the cracked pavement. He wouldn't look at me. He just held out a credit card. I'll pay for 2 weeks. That's all I can do. He left me there, under the flickering, buzzing neon sign, standing next to my 2 suitcases. This was my nadir. I had been expelled from my son's life, dispossessed and discarded. I was just as Brenda had described my gift, cheap junk, tossed out, broken. My room at the Summit View Inn smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. The carpet was thin and stained. I had my widow's pension, a modest sum that, for the first time in my life, felt truly insufficient. I was 68 years old, and I was in a place I had only ever read about in grim novels. The humiliation of that night, of being physically dragged from my son's home, did not curdle into despair. I did not sit and weep. I did not feel sorry for myself. As I sat on the thin, polyester bedspread, I felt a new emotion, an energy I had not felt since I was young. It was a cold, clarifying, and righteous anger. Cheap junk. Brenda's words echoed in the silence, not as an insult, but as a fatal miscalculation. She had looked at me and seen a relic, a piece of old clutter to be discarded. She had no idea that a librarian, a true librarian, is one of the most dangerous people you can underestimate. We are not just keepers of books. We are masters of information, navigators of the labyrinth. We are researchers. And Brenda, now, was my final, most important research project. I was not a victim. I was a researcher, and I was on a mission. The next morning, I did not go back to my son's house. I did not call him. I took a city bus to the main branch of the Pinecrest Public Library. It was a beautiful, large building, and the moment I walked in, the familiar scent of old paper and floor wax settled me. This was my territory. I did not use my own compromised laptop. I sat at a public terminal in the reference section, a hard-backed chair and a clean, anonymous desktop. I began with the simple, obvious truth. Brenda de Courcy was a fabrication. If that was a lie, then she had to have a truth. People like her do not spring from nowhere. They leave a trail of wreckage. I bypassed Google. I went straight to the aggregated newspaper archives, the same ones I had used to find the de Courcy gardeners. But my search terms were different now. I was no longer looking for family trees. I typed investment fraud, marriage scam, romance con. I paired these terms with words like socialite, heiress, and vulnerable businessman. The search returned thousands of results. I began to sift. I was not just looking for a story. I was looking for a pattern. Her pattern. I filtered by date, looking for incidents in the last 5 to 10 years. I read about women who conned lonely men out of their retirement savings, women who created fake companies, women who lied about their families. It took 3 hours, and then I found it. It was not a major headline. It was a local human interest story from a digital-only Arizona paper, the Scottsdale Chronicle, dated 3 years prior. The headline read, "Local entrepreneur devastated by sophisticated romance scam." I clicked. My hand was perfectly steady. The article detailed the story of a recently widowed businessman, a man who owned a successful chain of auto repair shops. He had met a woman, fallen in love, and had been convinced to marry her quickly. The woman, who called herself Jennifer Jenny Smith, had discovered a once-in-a-lifetime investment opportunity. She had convinced her new husband to liquidate a significant portion of his business assets, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to invest. The day after the money was transferred, Jennifer Smith vanished. The article included a photograph. It was a low-resolution security camera still, taken from the bank where she had last been seen. The image was blurry, grainy, the quality poor, but there was no doubt. It was her. The same bone structure, the same cold, empty, set to her eyes, captured even in that terrible lighting. The same smile I had seen in my son's living room, a smile that was a tool and nothing more. I scrolled down, and then I found the part that made the blood drain from my face. The article detailed the M.O., the modus operandi, as described by the Scottsdale police. The perpetrator specifically targets vulnerable, often grieving, men who have tangible business assets, such as real estate or family-owned companies. She does not just steal their cash. She convinces them to leverage or liquidate their own business holdings to fund a non-existent investment opportunity she controls. I closed my eyes. It was not a romance scam. Not really. It was a business operation. I thought of Mark, stressed and anxious, his phone pinging with banking alerts. I thought of Innovatech Solutions. I thought of the massive new investment from a private equity group called Apex Global Holdings. I finally understood. My son Mark was not Brenda's husband. He was her Mark. He was not her partner. He was her target. And Innovatech, his company, was the asset she was in the process of liquidating. This was no longer about a broken wooden bird. This was not about a thrown-out, grieving mother. This was a countdown. The scene at the party, Mark's declined card. The panic in his voice, it all meant that her plan was in its final stage. She was emptying the accounts. Soon. Jennifer Jenny Smith, or whatever her real name was, would disappear, leaving my son to face the financial ruin and, very likely, the legal consequences of a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. He would be her scapegoat. I was racing against a clock I couldn't see. I returned to the library terminal. Jenny Smith was the key. I needed more than one article. I needed a behavioral profile. I searched her name again, this time adding terms like victim and survivor and blog. It was there, buried on the third page of search results, a private, password-protected online forum. It was called The Phoenix Group, Rebuilding After J.S. I didn't have a password, but the login page had a description. A safe space for those who have been victimized by the predator known as Jenny Smith, Brenda DeCourcy, and many other aliases. If you have a story, you are not alone. My blood ran cold. Brenda DeCourcy. They already knew her current alias. I didn't need to get in. The login page itself gave me my next breadcrumb. I searched for the Phoenix Group and found a single, public blog post written by the group's founder, a man in Texas. It was a warning, a desperate plea for others to recognize the pattern. The stories he briefly summarized were devastating. A family home in California, foreclosed, a retirement portfolio in Florida, erased, an entire small business in Colorado, bankrupted. And then I read the sentence that stopped my breath. The founder wrote, "One of her key tactics is isolation. She will identify a target's core support system family, old friends, business partners, and systematically sever those ties. She often manufactures a story of her own past abuse, or claims her target's mother or sister is toxic or abusive, forcing the target to choose." I had to sit back from the screen. I was not a hindrance to Brenda. I was a tool. My presence in that house was not an inconvenience she had to tolerate. It was a scenario she had actively used. She had painted me as the senile, jealous, intrusive mother-in-law to isolate Mark, to make him dependent on her, to force him to choose her over his own blood. And he had. The anger I felt was so cold and so precise, it was almost peaceful. I was no longer just saving my son. I was avenging them all. I needed to understand the final piece of the puzzle, Innovatech. I went back to the business databases. I had been focused on Mark, but the Scottsdale MO said business assets. I looked up the full corporate filing for Innovatech Solutions. I read the list of officers, and there it was. Mark was not the owner. He was not even the primary partner. He was a vice president of business development, a low-level executive, the founder, president, and majority shareholder was a man I had never heard of, Mr. David Riley. Brenda had not married Mark for his money. She had married him for his access. He was her foothold, her way inside a company with real assets, real bank lines, and a real, unsuspecting CEO. My son was a security breach, a compromised password. This was so much bigger than I had imagined. I pulled up the press release about the large investment again, the one from Apex Global Holdings. This time, I searched for Apex Global Holdings in the corporate registries. It existed. It had been registered in Delaware just 6 months ago, 1 month before the investment was announced. The agent of record was a generic legal service. It was a shell company. I stared at the screen, and the entire, horrifying, brilliant labyrinth of her plan finally clicked into place. She hadn't brought in outside money. There was no investment. She had used Mark's access and her forged DeCourcy credentials to convince David Riley to accept a major investment from her family's private equity group. Then, she'd created an accounting nightmare. She'd used Innovatech's own capital, funneled through shell companies, to reinvest in Innovatech itself. It was a paper shuffle, a way to move money off the books, create false valuations, and, I suspected, secure new, massive loans against those falsified assets. She was not just emptying the bank accounts. She was leveraging the entire company into oblivion. And when the music stopped, the last man holding the bag, the man whose name was on the internal transfers, the man who brought the investor to the table, would be my son, Mark. My first realization, sitting on the edge of that musty motel bed, was that I could not go to Mark, the son I had raised. The man who had laughed and read books with me was gone. In his place was a terrified, hollow man, one who had already demonstrated that he would choose his abuser over his mother to protect the fragile illusion of his life. If I confronted him with the truth, he would not see it as a rescue. He would see it as an attack. He would panic. He would warn her, and she would be gone by midnight. Jenny Smith would evaporate, liquidating whatever she could on the way out, leaving my son to hold the empty bag, facing a storm of legal and financial ruin alone. My second realization was that I could not go to the police. Not yet. I was a 68-year-old woman with no money, staying in a weekly rate motel, accusing a wealthy, well-connected socialite of being a fraud. What was my evidence? A grainy photo from Arizona, a downloaded stock image, a theory about corporate finance I'd pieced together on a public computer. A good lawyer, paid for by Innovatech's own stolen money, would paint me as a senile, jealous, vindictive mother-in-law. It would be dismissed as a family dispute, and my warning would give Brenda all the time she needed to accelerate her escape. No. A direct confrontation was what she would expect. This could not be a clumsy, emotional attack. It had to be a quiet, precise, surgical procedure. I had to make her collapse inevitable, undeniable, and public. She built her life on lies told in whispers. I had to expose her with a truth shouted from the rooftops. I spent the next 3 days in the Pinecrest Public Library. I arrived when the doors opened at 9 in the morning and left when the security guard made his final rounds at 8 in the evening. I drank stale coffee from the basement vending machine and ate a protein bar in the stairwell for lunch. I was no longer a victim. I was a researcher. I was a librarian. And this was the most important act of cataloguing of my entire life. I compiled a dossier, a digital file, clean, organized, and irrefutable. The first item was the PDF of the Scottsdale Chronicle article about Jenny Smith. I used the library's software to digitally highlight the section describing her modus operandi: targets vulnerable men, liquidates business assets. The second item was a simple text document containing the link to the Phoenix Group Victim Forum. I copied and pasted the founder's quote about her primary tactic isolating her target by painting his family, specifically his mother, as toxic and abusive. The third item was the centerpiece. It was a simple 2-column image file I created myself. On the left, I placed a screenshot from Brenda's Instagram, showing the heavy silver frame on her mantel, the photo of her beloved grandfather. On the right, I placed the screenshot from the German stock photo database, showing the same man under the file name Elegant Older Man Smiling. I drew a single, thin, red arrow connecting the two. It was clean, brutal, and undeniable. The final piece was my own analysis. I was not an accountant, but I was a master of systems and information. I created a simple flowchart. It began with the registration date of Apex Global Holdings. An arrow pointed to the press release. 1 month later, announcing the investment in Innovatech. Another arrow pointed to the public filings. 2 weeks after that, showing Innovatech had secured new, massive business loans against its suddenly inflated assets. I titled the document, A Librarian's Analysis of Innovatech Financial Anomalies. I had my weapon. Now, I needed to deliver it. On the third day, using the library's public Wi-Fi, I created an anonymous, encrypted email address. I chose the name Librarian of Justice, protonmail.com. I attached my 4 documents as a single, compressed file, and I carefully selected my 3 targets. This was not a bomb. This was a simultaneous, multi-pronged surgical strike. The first email went to David Riley, the true CEO of Innovatech. He was the money. The subject line was crafted to bypass a secretary and ignite immediate legal panic: urgent internal compliance issue regarding Mark and Brenda Vance. The second email went to the public contact portal for the Pinecrest Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit. They were the law. Subject: information regarding an active serial con artist. The third email, and in many ways the most devastating, went to the one person Brenda had been desperately trying to impress since her arrival in Pinecrest, Mrs. Miller, the society columnist for the Pinecrest Gazette. She was the humiliation. Subject: Tip who really is Brenda de Courcy. Vance. I hit send. I sat for a moment in the silence of the reference section. I did not feel relief. I did not feel joy. I felt the quiet, cold satisfaction of a librarian closing a book that was long overdue. The information was now where it belonged. The dominoes did not just fall. They were set ablaze. David Riley, the CEO of Innovate Sino, a name I now knew well, was a businessman, not a fool. He received my email, and he did not need to be told twice. The stock photo comparison, paired with the term economic crimes, was enough. Within an hour, he had his internal auditors and his lawyers on a conference call. He ordered a full freeze on all accounts and credit lines associated with Mark Vance. The auditors, now armed with my librarian's analysis and looking for specific fraud, found the entire diseased root system in less than 3 hours. They saw the Apex shell company. They saw the wire transfers. They saw the falsified assets and the massive unsecured loans taken out in Innovatech's name. It was not a compliance issue. It was a multi-million-dollar heist in progress. David Riley, seeing his company leveraged to the brink of insolvency, did not just get angry. He got legal. He handed the entire, neatly packaged internal audit to the Pinecrest Police Department's Economic Crimes Unit. Simultaneously, Mrs. Miller, the society columnist, received her email. She read the Scottsdale article. She stared at the stock photo comparison, and she knew she had the biggest story of her career. She was a gossip, but she was not stupid. She couldn't publish a direct accusation without risking a lawsuit, but she didn't have to. She went to her blog, the one read by every single person of influence in Pinecrest. She posted a blind item at 8 in the morning. What local socialite, known for her Newport roots and minimalist taste, seems to have purchased her beloved grandfather from a German stock photo catalogue? Sources say her entire family tree might be available for a one-time licensing fee. Ouch. The community detonated. By noon, the whispers were a roar. Everyone in Pinecrest knew exactly who was being talked about. Brenda, in her beautiful, cold, grey house, knew none of this. The firewalls were closing in, the accounts were frozen, and her name was being whispered in contempt. But she was insulated, just for a few more hours, by her own all-consuming ego. That evening was her crowning achievement, a charity gala hosted at her home. She was raising funds for the local arts council, a move designed to cement her status as a philanthropic leader. She was, she hoped, finally going to be on the cover of Pinecrest Lifestyle magazine. The house was packed. The photographer from the Gazette was present, his flash popping. Brenda was standing on the minimalist slate hearth, a glass of champagne in her hand, her silk gown shimmering. She was in the middle of her speech, a practiced, humble-sounding thank you. "It is in giving," she purred, "that we truly receive, and the generosity I have seen in this community." The front door opened. 2 men walked in. They were not guests. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were in mismatched suits, their faces tired, and they walked with an authority that had nothing to do with money. The crowd, sensing a tear in the social fabric, parted. The detectives walked straight to the hearth. Brenda stopped her speech, her smile faltering. She looked at them, confused, then annoyed. I'm sorry, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. This is a private event. The lead detective, a man with a greying mustache, didn't bother to look at the crowd. He looked directly at her. His voice was not a whisper. It was clear, precise, and loud enough for the entire, silent room to hear. Ma'am, are you Jennifer Smith? The sound of the champagne flute shattering on the slate was the only noise in the room. Brenda's face, the one she had curated for so long, simply broke. The blood drained from it. The skin seemed to sag. It was not the face of Brenda de Courcy. It was the terrified, feral face of a cornered animal. She did not deny it. She did not argue. She did not ask, "What is this about?" She did the only thing Jenny Smith knew how to do. She turned, hiked up the skirt of her designer gown, and she ran. She bolted, a raw, panicked sprint, pushing past a state senator. She ran through her own party, past her stunned guests. She fumbled with the sliding glass door and burst out onto the patio. She ran across her perfect, manicured lawn, heading for the privacy fence at the back of the yard. It was a desperate, ugly scramble. She tried to climb it, her heels sinking into the sod, her hands clawing at the wood. The Gazette photographer, who had been sent to capture a socialite, captured a collapse. The flash went off, a brutal, repeated strobe, catching the moment she was pulled down. Her silk dress ripped, her face streaked with dirt, as the second detective grabbed her by the ankle. The downfall was absolute. The arrest was public. She was cuffed, mascara running down her face, on the lawn of the house she had stolen. It was 1 week later. The story had been on the front page of the Pinecrest Gazette for 3 days straight. The Innovatech scam socialite arrested for fraud. The details were all there: the Scottsdale warrant, the shell companies, the falsified assets. Brenda, or Jenny, or whatever her name was in the county jail, denied bail, and facing a raft of federal charges. Mark was, as David Riley had correctly surmised, a victim. He was not charged, but he was ruined. He had been fired from Innovatech, not for cause, but for gross negligence. The bank, acting on behalf of Innovatech's creditors, had seized the house the cold, grey monument to Brenda's lies. My son had lost his job, his home, and his wife, and he was facing a personal bankruptcy that would shadow him for the rest of his life. I was still at the Summit View Inn. I was packing my 2 small suitcases, preparing to move to a modest, 1-bedroom apartment I had found on the other side of town, when he found me. He didn't look like my son. The man who stood in the open doorway of my motel room looked a decade older. His suit was wrinkled, his face was grey with stubble, and his eyes were hollow, stripped of all their false, easy confidence. He did not have his arrogance anymore. He didn't ask to come in. He just sank onto the cheap, plastic chair that sat on the walkway outside my door, its legs scraping on the concrete. I sat on the edge of my bed, leaving the door open. We sat in the silence for a long time, listening to the sound of the highway. "You did this," he said. His voice was a dry rasp. It was not an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I was holding something in my hands. I had been repairing it, with a small tube of wood glue from the hardware store. It was the one meadowlark I had managed to save from the trash bin. The delicate wing was now fixed, a thin, pale scar of glue along the break. "No," I said, my voice quiet but not unkind. "She did this. You let her do this?" That was the thing that broke him. He didn't just cry. He began to sob. He put his head in his hands, and his body was racked with the kind of painful, ugly, gasping sobs that come from a place of deep, profound shame. "I've lost everything," he choked out, the words muffled by his hands. "Mum, I've lost everything." I waited. I let the silence stretch out again, letting his words hang in the humid air. I looked down at the small wooden bird in my hand. "Brenda told me my gift was cheap junk," I said. He flinched, but he didn't look up. I held the mended bird out. "She was wrong. My gift," I said, my voice steady, "was truth. My gift was legacy. My gift was Arthur's love, something he built with his own hands over 6 months. I looked at my son, this broken man in a wrinkled suit, and I felt not anger, but a vast, deep, and bottomless sorrow. "And she," I said, my voice sharp and clear. "She was the cheap junk. She was the imitation, the stock photo, the lie. And you chose her. You chose junk over family." He looked up, his face ravaged. "What can I do?" he whispered. "Mum, please. What can I do? How do I fix it?" I stood up. I had to. The conversation was over. "You have nothing left. Mark. You have no job, no house, no wife, no money. You have lost everything." I walked to the door and stood over him. "That means, for the first time in your life, you have an opportunity. You can finally build something on your own. Something real." I stepped inside my room, preparing to close the door. I was not going to invite him in. "Can I?" His voice was small, like a child's. "Can I call you sometime?" I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. I looked back at him. "One last time. You can try. But respect. Like trust. Mark. It isn't given. It's earned." I closed the door, leaving him alone on the walkway with the truth of his choices. I walked over to the dirty window of my room, the one that faced the highway. I placed the mended meadowlark on the sill, facing the sun. Thanks so much for listening to my story, folks. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's chat about it. And if you'd like to hear more, please subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, like this video, and support us by hitting that hype button so more people can hear this story.